Well, we are diving into our series Real, which we've been now in for about 4 weeks. And this series is all about this central idea. How can we show up authentically and live authentically in a world full of plastic? How can we begin to live an authentic life? Chances are that is a question that whether you follow Jesus or not, like you truly want to show up in your life and show up in this world authentically. And yet it's harder and harder to do that in the world that we live in, full of plastic, full of filters, full of all the expectations and boxes that culture tries to shove us in. And this series has been all about saying, how do we break outside those boxes? How do we show up as the real me? We talked about that in week 1. How do you show up as the real you? How do you find real human connection? And last week we talked about how do you experience real faith? And then this week, I want to talk about how can we experience making a real difference with our lives? How do we make a real difference with our lives? Not a performative difference, not just making a difference during the holiday season because that's when your company decides to go and make a difference throughout the year. Not making a difference because you can write it off on your taxes at the end of the year. Not making a difference by sharing a story on your feed of someone else making a difference, but actually you making a difference with your life. Like, how can we show up in this world and truly make a difference with our lives? Because I really believe, whether you believe it or not, I believe this about you, and that is that you are wired to make a difference. That your life has purpose, your life has meaning, and you may not believe that right now, but let me believe it for you. Your life has immense purpose, and something that keeps me up at night and wakes me up in the morning is seeing people rise to their fullest potential, to seeing people step in rhythm with the purposes that God has created them to know and to experience. You were created for a purpose. Let me take it a little bit further. You are where you are right now in your life. You are who you are in this life, and you have what you have in this life because God has you here for a purpose. Where you are has purpose, who you are has purpose, and what you have in your hands. Even if you look in what's in your hands and you think like, I don't got much to offer, I assure you that God has put everything that he has put in your hands to be used for a story that's greater than yourself. And there's something about living in a story that's greater than yourself that is actually really living, isn't it? Like when you settle for a life that is just all about you, all about your comfort, all about your preferences, and when we see other people doing that especially, right? It's harder to see it in ourselves, but when we see other people doing that, living a life where they are the center and everyone else is on the sidelines, I think all of us would agree, we would look at a person living that life and we would go, that doesn't look like living to me. That doesn't look like fully alive life. And we're at Canvas passionate about seeing you experience the fully alive life of Jesus, and we believe that part of that picture is living a life making a real difference. So let's talk about that this morning. But first, have you ever, a quick question, have you ever made a decision that before you made the decision, you were positive that it was the right decision? It was a good decision. It was a wise decision. You were like, this is the best decision I can make. And then have you ever made that decision and almost instantly realized it was none of those things that you just thought it was? That it was like the wrong decision, a bad decision, a very unwise decision, and you would do anything you could to go back in time to reverse the decision that you made. Am I the only one who's made decisions like this? Okay, by the looks on your faces, some of you can relate. I've had those moments. In fact, I think about now one of those moments when I was in 5th grade. Have you ever had one of those moments in your childhood that you can replay in your mind like it happened yesterday? I remember this moment because I was in 5th grade and my family was vacationing in Texas, which I don't know why you vacation in Texas. Who goes to Texas in the summertime? But we decided to go to Texas in the summertime, and I think largely because I had very wealthy aunt and uncle. Did anybody here when you were a kid have very wealthy family members and you loved going to their house on vacation because you felt like a king or queen while you were there? This was my aunt and uncle. They were filthy rich. They were the kind of people, I kid you not, they had a monogram of their initials etched on the bottom of their Olympic-sized swimming pool. That kind of wealthy, all right? And I loved going to their house because they also had a lake house. They had a house on a lake in Austin, Texas, and I loved this lake house because the lake was called Travis Lake. And it was in Travis County, and so I might be a little biased, but I thought, man, this is the best place on earth. And I remember Travis Lake as a 5th grader Not only because of the great experiences we had on the water there, but most of all because for the first time I experienced the power of something called the banana tube. Has anyone ever ridden a banana tube before? It is absolutely amazing. If you're not sure what a banana tube is, it is this long banana-like tube, hence the name, and it fits between like 2 to 5 people on the tube. They all sit in a straight line. And I remember this like it was yesterday because it was both the most amazing memory that also turned into like a really poor decision that I made. I was sitting on the front of the banana tube, and my 2 older sisters were sitting behind me, and my uncle was driving the boat. And I don't know if I like made my uncle mad that day or if he was just really tired of me, because it became apparent as soon as he started driving the boat that my uncle was trying to kill me. He was trying to kill me and my sisters because he was driving like a maniac. And I remember holding on for dear life on the banana tube. And we were just having the absolute best time. We were laughing, we were cheering, and we were doing everything we could not to fall off. And all of a sudden, while we were riding on this banana tube, our cheers and our laughter turns to this like blood-curdling scream because we hit this wave and the tube flew up in the air. You know, when you're younger, everything seems worse than it probably actually was. So in my 5th grade memory, we were like 100 feet in the air. We were probably like 1 foot, but it was 100 feet in my mind. And I remember we were in the air and I heard this blood-curdling scream of my sister behind me. And then all of a sudden, it went from blood-curdling scream to random words trying to be communicated in between gurgles of water. And I didn't know what was going on, but I realized I didn't fall off. I survived. I was so thankful, but I wondered where my sisters were. And so I looked behind me on the banana tube, and my sister wasn't sitting behind me any longer, but instead, she had somehow, to this day, I do not know how, she had fallen off the banana tube, but she was hanging on the side of the banana tube while holding onto the handle, and her body was like skipping on the side of the banana tube. She was just going up and down, up and down, up and down, and she was screaming, but also trying to communicate what she needed from me, and she was swallowing just an insane amount of water in the process. And so she was going, help me. And she is just gurgling and yelling, please help me. To this day, still don't know. She has the forearms of a Greek god. Like, I do not get it. But I remember I was in this moment, I was in a predicament because I was having a really good time on the raft. And I was sitting there and I realized the dilemma that I was facing, that I could either continue to ride and enjoy my experience on the raft, or I could turn around, reach out my hand, and help my sister. And I thought the second option sounded like the right thing to do. You know, there was a moment inside of me where I thought, you know, she should have held on tighter. I'm younger than her. I'm still here. What's her problem? She needs it. Why do I need to ruin my ride in order to get her back on the banana tube? I thought that for a moment. But then all of a sudden, that little angel popped up on my shoulder and was like, Travis, how could you say or think such a thing? This is your own flesh and blood. This is your sister. You need to save her, and you are the only one who can do it. And so I remember deciding, all right, fine. I'll save my sister. And I turned around, and I swear there was like the Baywatch theme song playing in the background. And I reached out to my sister, and I said, I will save you. And I reached out, and our fingertips touched one another. And then I had a change of heart. I realized, no, I'm really enjoying this ride. And so what I did next, I'm ashamed to tell you, as she reached out for my hand, I judo chopped her wrist. And she went down the water, just skipping. I mean, to this day, many years later, I think if you listen quietly at Travis Lake, you'll still hear her body skipping down the lake. And I realized in that moment, I think I made the wrong decision. The not so kind or loving decision. And when we recovered her body, we brought her back into the boat. And I remember she punched me, and she's like, what were you thinking? Why did you do that? And I kid you not, this was my response. Well, you know how in that movie, Old Yeller, when the dog was really sick and the owner just kind of, that's kind of what I was thinking. And she just punched me. I was like, I was just trying to do the kind, loving thing and put you out of your misery. And she didn't think it was as funny as you might think it was. And years later, I still think it's funny, and I'm not sure if she does, but I made this decision that has stuck with me to this very day. And here's why it stuck with me, because it was in this moment in time as a fifth grader on Lake Travis on a banana tube that I realized something about myself. What I realized about myself is that I have the capacity within me to put my preferences, my comfort, my convenience above the needs of somebody else. That there's actually something within me that if I'm not careful, and it's still there within me, by the way, where I will put myself at the center of the story while putting everybody else on the sidelines. And I'll help you as long as it doesn't cross this line of sacrifice. There's this part of me that's still there, and chances are, I bet there's a little part of you that behaves the same way if you're not careful. A part of you that will help if you get something in return. That will reach out and sacrifice as long as the cost isn't too much. As long as it doesn't cost you your preference or your comfort or even your control or even your spot on the proverbial raft that you might be living your life on. I'll help you as long as it doesn't threaten my ride. And see, I learned this about myself. And chances are I'm not the only one who struggled with it. And I've learned in my life that if I'm going to make a real difference in my life, I've got to make a decision. Will I allow that voice to drive my life forward? Or will I live my life being shaped and informed by a better voice, a different voice, a voice that calls me to make a real difference through sacrificial love? And that's sort of the question I want to pose to all of you today. Are you living your life being driven and informed by sacrificial love? Or are you living your life simply just trying to protect your spot on the raft? Just trying to protect preference, protect your comfort, protect status, protect anything, any cost that you might incur on you. And today I want to invite you into a bigger, better, and more beautiful way. And it's not the Travis way, it's the Jesus way. It's the way of sacrificial love. It's the way in which we can live our life where Jesus is above us and people are before us. Where we live our lives willing to serve and show up for those who are in need of our help. Are you with me? It's not easy though, right? Because come on, who doesn't want to live a life of sacrificial love? I think we all say we want to live this life. We all want to make a real difference. So what is holding us back? Today I want to invite you into a better life, a life of difference making in the lives of others. And Jesus, he tells us this story in Matthew chapter 25. And it's sort of a haunting story. It's actually a sort of unsettling story. Because Jesus, he actually doesn't talk that much about life after death. That might be news to you. Some of you are like, I thought that's all Jesus cared about because that's all your pastor when you were a kid seemed to care about. But I'm telling you, actually, Jesus didn't talk much about life after death. He does every now and again. In this case, we'll look at one example of that. But more often than not, he actually seems to be preoccupied with life before death. But in this story, Jesus actually invites us into a new way of living, and he does so by talking about what happens after we die. And in this story, Jesus explains what happens after we die and two different kinds of people that will be present on the other side of eternity. And he tells a story in Matthew 25, verse 31. He says this, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' Then these righteous ones will reply, 'Lord, when did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink, or a stranger and show you hospitality, or naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you sick in prison and visit you?' And the king will say, 'I tell you the truth. When you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, let's say these next 5 words out loud together. You were doing it to me. Then the king will turn to those on the left and say, away with you, you cursed ones, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his demons. For I was hungry, and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty, and you didn't give me a drink. I was a stranger, and you didn't invite me into your home. I was naked, and you didn't give me clothing. I was sick in prison, and you didn't visit me. And then they will reply, Lord, when did we ever see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and not help you? And he will answer, I tell you the truth. When you refuse to help the least of these, my brothers and sisters, let's say these 6 words out loud together, you were refusing to help me. And they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous will go into eternal life. So not quite the story you're probably going to read to your kids at night. It's unnerving, isn't it? I think a lot of times we're like, don't talk that way, Jesus. Because it's a little intense what he's actually saying in this moment. And yet, if we understand what Jesus is saying in this moment, we understand the bigger, better, and more beautiful life that Jesus has actually invited us into here and now. But to understand what Jesus is talking about, the first thing we need to discuss is we need to talk a little bit about sheep and goats. Jesus uses this metaphor. Goats are just ugly. Can I get an amen on that? Jesus uses this metaphor of sheep and goats. And the analogy is actually really, really powerful when you understand the difference between these two animals. But because most of us are not shepherds, we read this story about sheep and goats, and it doesn't really hit. It doesn't really speak. It really doesn't seem very relevant because unless you're a shepherd in this room, you likely have no relationship with sheep and goats. But when you understand the metaphor that Jesus is telling us, it actually makes perfect sense, and it's really convicting. See, sheep and goats can be easily mistaken as the same, but it's really their behavior that ultimately separates the two. I mean, if we talk about sheep first, sheep have a natural sort of flocking instinct. That they love being a part of the flock, and they get the most agitated, frustrated, and upset when they are separated from the flock or another one of their sheep friends are separated from the flock. They get frustrated. And they love being in community. They're more gentle. They're more kind. I mean, have you ever met somebody who's like, you know what animal I hate? Sheep. Like, no one says that. You look at that and you're like, aw, little sheep. You know, even if you're not a farmer like me, I would never go on a farm. I think sheep are adorable. But goats are not one of those creatures. Goats are actually fundamentally different in how they navigate life and view themselves. Goats are high maintenance. Goats are like the divas of the animal kingdom. Goats, when they have their mind set on something that they want, they will do everything to get it. If they like the smell of their shepherd's hair, they will be relentless in trying to eat their shepherd's hair. No matter how much the shepherd has done for them, loved them, and provided them, all they think is, that hair smells good, I must eat it. And some of you know this. You've gone to a petting zoo. Have you ever been to a petting zoo? Or maybe you brought your kid to a petting zoo, or you were a kid at a petting zoo and a goat starts smelling you and starts nibbling on your shirt and you're like, oh, okay, buddy. But then 5 minutes later, it's still going at your shirt trying to eat whatever it is that it smells. And the only option you really have is to run away from the goat. You can swipe at it. You can say no. You can say stop it, but it won't listen. Goats are that stubborn because what a goat wants, that's what they pursue at all costs. Goats are ultimately really independent creatures who are motivated by their own desires. They're not interested in pleasing the shepherd. They're really just interested in pleasing themselves and getting whatever it is that they want in that current moment at time, no matter the cost. So maybe we're starting to see the analogy Jesus is communicating here. And just in case you're not, let me break it down. Jesus is saying there are 2 types of people in this world. There's sheep, there's goats. There's people who live in community, who see their need for one another and relationships, who want everyone to be set up for success, that are driven by kindness and love and gentleness, who will do what is right for the whole, even if it isn't comfortable for them individually. And then there's goats. There's goats, and what I mean is there are people who live, and all that really matters to them is what they want. And all that really drives them is their desires. And they will pursue what they want, and they will get what they want, even if it costs somebody else. Even if it comes at the expense of somebody else. Even if it's like writing on a banana tube and it means cutting your sister's hand off so that she can go skip down Travis Lake on her own. That's sort of like what living like a goat is. And Jesus says there's these two kinds of people, sheep and goats. And he seems to connect the blessing that we experience in the next life will be whether we were sheep or goats in this life. Jesus seems to believe that there's some aspect of God's blessing that we will have in the life after death that will be determined how we loved and lived in this one. And by the way, just to make sure we're clear, Jesus is not saying that you are saved by your good works. Jesus makes it so clear that we are saved by grace alone. The brother of Jesus, James, makes it so clear that we're saved by grace alone. All the New Testament authors, they were on the same page about this. We are saved by grace alone. So we're not saved by our good works. But Jesus seems to believe we are saved for good works. Do you understand the difference? Like, we're not saved from something as much as we are also saved for something. We're saved for what God is doing in the world. And by the grace of God, we get to have relationship with Jesus. But Jesus seems to believe those who walk with Jesus and practice the way of Jesus and are about the kingdom's business, they prioritize people, that they make others matter in how they live, that they live a life of sacrificial love. And Jesus seems to believe the blessings we experience in the next life depend on whether we live as a sheep or goat in this one. So I guess that's the question we got to ask ourselves, right? Like, if we're being honest, I'm not going to ask, like, raise your hand if you're a goat, raise your hand if you're a sheep. I'm not going to ask you to do that. But seriously, I want you to ponder that on the inside real quick. Am I living like a sheep or am I living like a goat? When people talk about me, do they say that is a person who lives out sacrificial love? They're gentle, they're kind, they're gracious, they're humble. You can just tell they actually care about people. Or when people talk about you or think about you, do they go, that's sort of a person that, like, they really only show up when it's convenient. They really only love when it's comfortable. They'll only give if they get something in return. Like, what would people say about yourself? And if you were honest about yourself, would you say, are you living like a sheep or a goat? Or to bring it back to our analogy at the very beginning, are you living your life on the banana tube or the rescue raft? Right? Like, are you living your life on the banana tube or the rescue raft? Are you living your life with everybody else behind me? Hope they're having a good ride, but this is my ride, so I'm going to make sure I enjoy it to the fullest. Or do you live your life in a rescue raft that instead of being one long tube with people behind you, it's a circle where instead of you don't look at anybody, you look at everybody. Instead of it being all about where you're going, it's actually about finding where people are sinking beneath the drowning waters of life, and we reach into the waters and pull their hand out and pull them out. Like, how are you living your life? The banana tube or the rescue raft? So I don't know about you, I want to live my life on the rescue raft. I hope when I die, I can look around and just say, man, I lived a life, and this rescue raft is full. Not making myself the Savior or Messiah. It's not a Messiah complex, but it is saying I want to live a life where I'm not the center of it. I want to live a life that serves others. I want to live a life where I reach into the waters that people are sinking into and help pull them out and help them rise to their fullest potential. And chances are you want that with your life as well. And Jesus makes it clear in Matthew 25 that it's those who love others, that clothe the naked, that feed the hungry, that give a drink to the thirsty, that care for the sick, who visit those in prison. He said they will experience the blessing of God. And Paul, he put it this way in 2 Corinthians. He says in 2 Corinthians 14, he says, or 5:14, he says, either way, Christ's love controls us. Like, I want to get to the point where I'd be like, what controls me? I want to be like, Christ's love. I don't know if I'm there yet. How about you? Like, ask me when the Warriors lose a game. Christ's love does not control me in that moment. Rage does. But either way, Christ's love controls us. Since we believe that Christ died for all, we also believe that we have all died to our old life. He died for everyone. Everyone say everyone. He died for everyone, so that those who receive this new life will no longer live for themselves. Instead, they will live for Christ, who died and was raised for them. I mean, one of the byproducts of having a relationship with Jesus is not that you is not that you think less of yourself, but more so that you just think of yourself less. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, being like, oh, I'm just like the pawn scum of humanity. I don't matter. I have no, that's not it. That's self-deprecation. That's not what Jesus is after. What is humility? It's not thinking less of yourself. It's just thinking of yourself less. It's saying, hey, this person is in need and I have the capacity to reach out and pull them out of the situation, so I'm going to do that. Why? Because Christ's love controls me. Because the love of Christ compels me to do for others what Jesus has done for me and, in fact, did for all people. The love of Jesus calls us off of the banana tube, off of the old life, into a life on the rescue raft where we look where people are in need and we put ourselves in that situation and we pull them out of the rising waters. And you know what jumped out to me the most with Matthew 25? Probably my favorite part of that sort of dark story Jesus tells is that Jesus goes like, I was hungry, you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. I was sick, you cared for me. I was in prison, you visited me. And they were like, what? That was you? Like, they were like, I had no idea. When were you hungry? When were you thirsty? When were you sick? When were you in prison? And Jesus was like, oh yeah, by the way, you were doing it for me when you did it for them. They had no idea, which tells me something about their mindset. They weren't doing any of those things because they were going to get something in return. They weren't doing any of those things because they could write it off at the end of the year on their taxes. They didn't do any of those things because, it's the holidays and that's when we should be kind. They didn't do any of those things even because they thought maybe it's Jesus. They simply did the right things because it was the right thing. And I love that about them. They did the right thing because it was simply the right thing. What if we just lived our life that simply? I'm just going to do the right thing because it's the right thing. I'm going to show up for people because it's the right thing. I'm going to forgive people because it's the right thing. I'm going to help when I can help because it's the right thing. I'm going to care for others when I can care for them because it's the right thing. I'm going to do the right thing because it's the right thing. What I love about the people in Matthew 25 is it wasn't just that they knew how to love people. They apparently did. But even more, what's impressive about the people in Matthew 25, they didn't know how not to love people. You see, I think all of us know how to love people. But do you know how not to love, how to get to that point where you're like, I can't help but love people. I have no other option. I have to do this. I'm not there yet. Maybe you're not either. So there's no shame attached to this. But I want to get there. I want us to be a church that doesn't only know how to love people. Like, we don't know how not to love people. We don't know how not to show up. We don't know how to speak up for the oppressed and the silenced. We don't know how to meet those who are being crushed by oppression or systemic injustice. We don't know how not to show up and stand by them and be for them. Like, we don't know how not to love people. I want to get to that point as a church that we don't even know how, that doesn't even compute to us. In fact, as Kurt mentioned earlier, this is one of the reasons we are building out this space the way that we're building it out. We could have said, hey, let's just build a church for church people so that we can have a place to meet on Sundays. But we didn't do that. We did this, we were going at this because we want this space to not only be a blessing to us, but even more a blessing to others. We want it to be a blessing to people who may never show up here on Sundays. And that's why we're going to open up a community space, because San Francisco, especially post-COVID, seems to really lack community spaces where people can find friendship and build community. I can't tell you how many times I talk to people who are lonely in San Francisco. We want to help solve that problem. Why? So they'll show up on Sunday. Maybe they'll come, but that's not why we're doing it. We're just doing it because it's the right thing. Why do we want to provide a kids space, for an indoor play space for kids to play in and families to connect in throughout the week? Because San Francisco, can we be real, is not doing a good job making it easy for families to be here. All my parents. Amen, all right? Like, that is true. It is the most childless city in the country, and it has almost no indoor play spaces for children. I think that's crazy. And are we going to solve the entire problem? No, but we're going to do our part. We're going to put a dent in the problem, and we're going to build an indoor kids space so the kids can play and parents can connect and grow with one another, that they can finally have community. Why are we doing a nonprofit coffee shop? Because we want to reinvest in San Francisco. I've already had people ask, but why don't we just take all the money that comes in from that to lower our overhead as an organization? Sure, that makes sense. But you know what is even better? Ridiculous generosity and ridiculous love. And not just doing things because they benefit us, but doing things because they benefit others. So we're going to have a nonprofit coffee shop that will reinvest back into San Francisco. If you look at our Here to Stay campaign, I don't think you could say we're doing this all for us. I mean, it really is largely about how we can be a blessing to others. We're not just building a building, we're building a blessing for the city of San Francisco. That's why I'm not shy about asking you to invest and be a part of it. In fact, some of you in this room might have the capacity to get us to that $1.3 million. We're a little less than 500,000. Maybe you're here and you today can get us to that finish line. Let's do this. And some of you just laugh at that idea. And you're like, I can give $5. Then give $5. Every step counts. Why? Because we're a church that doesn't just know how to love, we don't know how not to love. We're a church committed to being a blessing, not just getting blessings. We're a church that's committed to making a difference. So if that's not your thing, and you're like, I just really want to show up, sit in a seat on Sunday, teach me something, pastor, and then leave the exact same, you're going to hate Canvas. Because we're a church committed to every single person on the other side of these walls. And we're committed to every single person on the other side of these walls. And yes, we're committed to you too. But we're committed to them. Why? Because Jesus is committed to them. And when Jesus died for you, he also died for them. And we are going to make a difference in this city. But the question is, how do you do that as an individual person, day to day? Let me give you 3 ways that you can begin to make a difference as soon as this afternoon. You can begin to make a difference as soon as this afternoon by just doing these 3 things. The first is this. If you're taking notes, go ahead and write it down. I want you to pray with eyes wide open. Pray with eyes wide open. And you're like, is that poetic, metaphorical? No, I literally mean pray and open your eyes. There is something about walking through your neighborhood. I dare you this week, at least one time this week, walk through your neighborhood and pray. And you could do it in your head or out loud, whatever. But have your eyes open and say, God, show me something I'm not seeing in my neighborhood. Show me the people that I walk by every single day. Show me the needs. Show me the brokenness. Show me the violence. Show me the injustices. Show me the problems so that I can be a part of bringing a solution here in San Francisco. See, I want to invite you to pray with eyes open when you're walking through the neighborhood, when you're on the Muni. Some of you are like, I pray every time I'm on the Muni. But this time, pray with eyes open and say, God, what do you want to show me? And maybe when you go into your office, maybe when you are on your bike, I don't care where or when, but pray this week with your eyes wide open, asking God to open up the eyes of your heart to see what he's seeing. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 18, Paul, he says this, pray in the Spirit at all times and on every occasion. Stay alert and be persistent in your prayers for all believers everywhere. And that's really the call I'm inviting you into. What would it look like for you to pray with your eyes wide open, to stay alert in your prayers? See, one of the most dangerous prayers you can pray is, God, help me to see what you're seeing. Help me to see what you're seeing. And you want to go further, God, break my heart for what is breaking yours. And it's dangerous because God will do it. God will open your eyes. God will make you uncomfortable. And God will call you off the banana tube and into the rescue raft to be a part of what God is doing here in San Francisco. And the second thing I want to invite you to do is, after you pray with eyes open, is to live with lives bowed. Pray with eyes wide open and then live with your life bowed. That we live our life with our hands open and our heart open, ready to give what we can. And by the way, this isn't a call to give what you can't have. Scripture never calls you to give what you don't have. It just says, hey, if you have a capacity to give, start there. Start with what you have and watch God do immeasurable things with it. I've said this before, but if you want to experience the supernatural in your life, God never expects you to bring the super, but he does invite you to bring the natural. And when you bring the natural, then God will do the super with it. When you say, this is all I got, here you go, God. Watch God do supernatural things with your natural obedience. And that's what it looks like to live with lives bowed. I love what John writes in 1 John. He says, we know what real love is. So apparently for the last couple thousand years, there's also then fake love, inauthentic love, disingenuine love. He says, but we know what real love is because Jesus gave up his life for us. So we also ought to give up our lives for our brothers and sisters. If someone has enough money to live well and sees a brother or sister in need but shows no compassion, how can God's love be in that person? Dear children, let's not merely say we love each other. Let us show the truth by our actions. our actions will show that we belong to the truth. So we will be confident when we stand before God. I mean, that's a convicting couple verses right there. He's like, if you're like, hey, you say you love people, but you don't actually help people when you have the capacity to do it, then John's like, you sure you love God as much as you say you do? Because he's saying the proof is in the pudding, right? He's like, the proof is in what you actually do with your life and the compassion you live your life with. To John, it doesn't matter what's on our Christian t-shirts or titles of our sermons or Christian music. All that is irrelevant if we're not going out in the world and loving people like Jesus loves people and showing up for people like Jesus shows up for people. See, John makes it clear that if you want to see God's kingdom come in San Francisco, you got to live your life saying, God, my kingdom has to go. You can't say, God, your kingdom come and my kingdom stays. It's got to be, God, your kingdom comes, my kingdom's got to go. That's what it means to live with your life bowed. So how do you pray? Pray with your eyes wide open, live with your life bowed, and then here's the most important one, right from Matthew 25. And this will just change everything. If you do this, it'll just change how you treat all people. And the third thing is this: love others like they're Jesus in disguise. Love others like they're Jesus in disguise. Some of you are like, have you met my boss? That's Satan in disguise right there. Nah, man, I mean, what would happen? What would happen if you started looking at people and saying, this is Jesus in disguise? That person in need, that coworker who maybe is a little bit difficult, but you're like, okay, you're Jesus in disguise. I guarantee you start telling yourself that and looking at people through this lens of people being Jesus in disguise, then you're going to love people so much better. You're going to show up for people in a completely different way. Here's a conviction I have. I would almost call it a holy fear, if I can be real with you for a moment, and then we'll wrap up. Farrick, you want to come up? My holy fear as a pastor of this church is that we will worship a homeless man named Jesus on Sunday, and then we'll walk by every homeless man on Monday. And I'm talking about any person in need. And we're gonna say we love Jesus, and we're gonna raise our hands and clap our hands and say, God, we want to be a part of changing the city and impacting the city, and we want our lives to count. We want to make a difference, and then already by Monday we've forgotten it all because it makes us uncomfortable or because it might cost us something. I'll tell you what, can I get real? Can I get real right now? We're going there. I'm so tired of people talking about San Francisco like it's Gotham. Like, it's not, man. It's got some rough edges. It's got some dark spots. And you know what? I expect some people to talk about the city like that. But I expect the church to be better than that. I expect Christians to be better than that. I mean, if anything, the more darkness there is in the city, the more hopeful we should be that light can shine brighter. The more loss and death and brokenness that we see in San Francisco, the more hopeful we should get, because at the heart of our story is about how Jesus conquers death, not is crushed by it. So if there's anyone in the city that should be the most optimistic, the most hopeful, the most purpose-driven, it should be Christians. And so it drives me nuts when I see Christians just joining the narrative and shutting the book on San Francisco. Can I tell you what? God has not shut the book on San Francisco. The story is not over for San Francisco. There's not one person in this city that God's like, nah, they're a little too broken, a little too messy, they just got too much junk. No, there's not one person that Jesus has ever given up on. And as long as that's the case, there should not be one person in the city that we as followers of Jesus give up on either. But instead, we should be the first ones on the rescue raft, going to the deepest and most raging waters happening in our city, pulling out every hand that we can grab a hold of, and helping them rise to who they were created to be in Christ. That's the church I want to be a part of. How about you, Canvas? Yeah, and I think we can be a part of that. And I think San Francisco deserves a church like that. A church that will not hide in their services, but a church that will show up in the world with the hope and light and love of Jesus on the rescue raft, always making room for one more. Let's pray. God,